I'm going to start the timer on your first word, Dr. Ben Burgis.
All right. Thank you, Kaz. And thank you for doing this, Stuart. Before we get into the meat of the argument, I do want to spend just a minute clarifying the position I'm going to argue for, if only because I wouldn't want anyone to be unclear about this part. I'm an atheist, but I'm not an anti-theist. As I just mentioned, just wrote this book about the late Christopher Hitchens. And while I'm sympathetic to aspects of his critique of a lot of religious beliefs, this is a point where I really do part ways from him. Hitch was an anti-theist. He famously said that religion poisons everything. I don't really think that's right. I think unjust social hierarchies poison everything, and that religion is often used as a rationalization for those hierarchies. Whether we're talking about, gender relations in contemporary Saudi Arabia, or for that matter, contemporary Moscow, Idaho, or the divine right of kings ideology undergirding European feudalism. But religious traditions are big, broad things with lots of warring interpretations. And I personally have a huge soft spot for Christian socialists like Martin Luther King or Cordell West, or just to pick a third example of a progressive Christian at random, my wife, Jennifer. Christian leftists like that don't want to impose their religious beliefs on anyone else, but they do find inspiration in those beliefs for fighting for a fairer and more equal society. And that sounds good to me. Certainly, I like MLK and Cordell West and Jennifer a hell of a lot better than I like the kind of atheists who love Ayn Rand or maybe want secularism to be spread to Iran by the 82nd Airborne. But even so, I am an atheist, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So let's get into it. First point, if we're arguing not just about whether there's some sort of transcendent being, but about whether there's a God who's both all-powerful and morally perfect, I actually think the world is soaking in evidence that at least this kind of God doesn't exist. To borrow an analogy from my friend Mark Warren, if I told you that there was an invisible giant who walked around all day, every day, painting the sky yellow, your first question wouldn't even be, where's the evidence? Your first question would be, why isn't the sky yellow? There's a similar problem with the belief that the universe was created and is ruled by an all-powerful, morally perfect being. The problem with this is usually called the problem of evil, although that word evil sometimes throws people off, because we're not just talking about people doing evil things to one another. We're talking about undeserved, unnecessary, gratuitous suffering, whether it comes about from evil human actions or cancer or earthquakes or accidents on the highway. One of my favorite professors in grad school, Quentin Smith, points out in one of his papers that you could run the problem of evil just based on natural laws that lead some animals to kill and eat other animals in really cruel ways that involve a lot of suffering, inflict a lot of suffering on the prey. We don't think the predators themselves are evil because we don't think they have free will in the matter, but that's not the question. The question is, would a morally perfect being have set it up that way? Would even a morally kind of sort of okay being have set it up that way? And I've got to say, that doesn't seem plausible to me. Now, theists have all sorts of ways of trying to explain this problem away. I'm sure we'll get into some of those later in the discussion. Right now, I just want to throw down a marker on the proposition that none of those attempts to explain it away are very convincing. But hey, maybe I'm wrong about that. Let's assume for the sake of argument that I am, and that there's a super convincing answer to the problem of evil. If so, that just brings us back to the question of whether there's any evidence for the existence of God, any serious evidence. I don't think so. To give you some sense of why not, let's take a quick look at some of the main pieces of evidence that have been offered over the centuries. Start with the teleological argument. That's the fancy name, but in plain English, the argument from design. Even a century before Darwin, David Hume had a lot of fun with this one in his dialogues concerning natural religion. Hume points out that even if, for the sake of argument, you do accept that someone or something outside of the universe had to create it, there's absolutely nothing about the evidence around us that suggests that this something would have to be an all-powerful, loving, personal God. It could just as easily be a committee of gods. In fact, there's a lot about our world that would make a lot more sense if it was designed by committee and the committee members weren't always on the same page and sometimes they got in each other's way. Or it could be something totally impersonal, like a kind of cosmic spider mindlessly spinning universes. That sounds silly to us, but Hume points out that's because we're not spiders. We're rational creatures who design things in a conscious way using our reason, and we attribute that to the unknown cause of the universe, but that's arbitrary. And he points out that underlying assumption that anyone or anything did create the universe is also arbitrary. Why would we believe that? Why shouldn't we think that some version of the universe has always existed? Well, fast forwarding from Hume to the present day, contemporary physicists tell us that the universe we live in expanded out from this zero-dimensional space-time point that was the Big Bang singularity about 13.7 billion years ago. But even if that's true, that still leaves open the question of whether our bang was the first bang. There are string theorists who postulate that our expanded and then dying soap bubble of a universe coexists with a multitude of other soap bubbles, with every black hole in one universe being the Big Bang of a new baby universe. And if we're asking whether that's true, that gets tricky. It's very hard to have direct evidence for or against string theory, just as it's very hard to have direct evidence for or against the contrary speculation that our bang was the first bang. But from what I understand, it seems like what string theorists are saying is a mathematically elegant way of connecting the dots of a lot of pieces of empirical evidence that we do have. And so many scientists believe it's rational to accept it as a matter of inference to the best explanation. Fans of Destiny's YouTube channel will know that I'm a big fan of this concept from philosophy of science, inference to the best explanation. That's the principle that when you have two theories that are both logically consistent with all of the evidence, you need to judge which one is a better explanation by trying to figure out which one is simpler and cleaner, and which one has more of what philosophers of science call explanatory power. Those two don't always point in the same direction, and so on. But hey, I'm not a physicist. Stuart isn't a physicist. And neither of us are in much of a position to make a well-informed argument one way or the other about the details of this part. So just as an intellectual exercise, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that string theory isn't true. Let's assume that our bang was the first bang. Great. Do we then have a good reason to think that God created the Big Bang singularity? Well, some people say yes, and if you push them about why they say yes, they'll say it's because something can't come from nothing. Push them a little further, and what people usually say is, well, why can't something come from nothing? They'll say, well, because everything has to have a cause. All right, fine. Let's go with that principle. Everything has to have a cause. But here's the problem. If the chain of causes goes back forever, then every link in that chain does have a cause. It's caused by the previous link. Whereas if there's a first cause, then by definition, that first cause would be an uncaused cause. We've actually violated the principle that everything has a cause. Now, to be fair, there are more complicated and sophisticated versions of the cosmological argument out there. I'd be happy to talk about some of those in open discussion or Q&A. But if we do, my position is going to be that the more complicated and sophisticated versions all end up falling prey to a more complicated and sophisticated version of the what about God? Why doesn't God need a cause objection? But let's say I'm wrong about that, and there's some way to get around this problem. Here's the bigger issue. In another one of his papers, the late Quentin Smith pointed out that even if you totally buy the argument that there has to be a first cause, there's no reason at all to say that the first cause has to be any sort of God. It makes at least as much sense to say that the original Big Bang singularity itself was the first cause than to knock it back one step by saying that God was the first cause. Saying that the first cause is an infinite mind that loves us and cares about us might fit better with our poetic sensibilities as human beings than saying it was a mindless zero-dimensional space-time point. But in terms of the structure of the argument, it's hard to see why we actually have any more reason to think that God was the uncaused first cause, if there was one, than that the Big Bang singularity was the uncaused first cause. But even if the classic arguments for the existence of God are as bad as I say they are, that by itself, you might think, doesn't get me all the way to atheism. Why am I not just an agnostic, reserving judgment one way or the other? Well, we talked a little bit about the problem of evil, and I actually do think that the problem of evil gives us a good reason to be atheists and not just agnostics, at least if we're talking about a morally perfect God. But even if we assume for the sake of argument there's some good answer to the problem of evil, I'd still be an atheist, not just an agnostic. And here's why. Earlier, I mentioned inference the best explanation. If we have multiple explanations that are all logically consistent with the evidence, what we have to do is to compare them and see which one's better. So let's say that you say that there's an invisible giant, but he doesn't paint the sky yellow. He just repaints it blue. It's already blue and he adds another blue layer. And you further say that the giant doesn't crush farmhouses and skyscrapers as he moves around repainting the sky blue, since the giant is magic. It just passes through the buildings like a ghost. And assuming you keep adding qualifications until we have to admit that the existence of this invisible giant repainting the blue sky more blue is logically consistent with all of our evidence, just like his non-existence is logically consistent with all of our evidence, I still don't think that most of us would be agnostic about whether there was a giant. I don't think we'd reserve judgment. I think we'd just say, no, that's probably not true. And for similar reasons, I think we should say the same thing about God. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.